Okay. Name Mark Woodley, age 72, today's date 22nd of November 2021, location Amsterdam, the Netherlands, name of interview partner John Winkleman, and relationship to partner, I would say we have a friendly history, and I'm very fond of him.
Okay, my name is John Winkleman. I'm 54. Today is November 22nd, 2021. Location, West Warwick, Rhode Island. My interview partner is Mark Woodley. My relationship, it's complex. Mark is not someone I've ever socialized with. But at the same time, because of these events, he's somebody who I do feel a very strong emotional connection to. He's someone who I do really care about, and I just feel very strongly associated with him.
Oh, I start the questions. I mean, when you gave your age, John, I knew at what?
Our ages are so different.
Are so different. I'm 2 generations ahead of you.
No, that's not it. I was 24 back then. You were 42, and now we're like, 30 years.
I know.
Exactly 30 years.
You were like an Energizer bunny. You had so much energy. And I'm thinking, because this is in line with the first question, because, that was 1991. And around 82 or so, when AIDS first came on the scene, you were much younger. You were like a preteen or in your early teen years. So
15.
the thing when in talking about AIDS now to people, because I hang out with a lot of people who are much younger, who don't have a historical context, give us a little historical context. What was going on in your life when you first became aware of AIDS? How old were you? Where were you? How did it affect you?
The first really big awareness of AIDS was I got a job in an office of a summer camp in upstate New York when I was 15. And working in the office, somebody received, it might have been either Time Magazine, I think it was Time Magazine. It was when they did that cover story on AIDS. And, that came through the office and the mail and stuff like that. And I read that. And that was my first awareness. And that was about a year and a half before I started coming out. I came out in high school when I was 16. And then that went from a news story to something that, oh my God, is going to affect me personally. And being a gay teen, the first big issues in my life was just, dealing with the isolation of thinking I'm the only gay person in the world and doing that. But then as I joined a gay youth group and, started getting involved with the gay community while I was still in high school, then it became a bigger deal. And I remember that senior year of high school, every year Pilgrim High School in Warwick, Rhode Island, would do a talent show to benefit the Letterman's Association, and they did a preview during the school day, and the MCs were 3 jocks, and all the jokes that they told in this preview during the school day were either ethnic jokes, and half of them were gay jokes or AIDS jokes, and I was just so rip-roaring mad. I just stormed out of the auditorium, went to the principal's office, and started screaming, and, he tried to dismiss me, but then a Polish teacher who didn't like the Polish jokes, came in and complained. A teenager who was dealing, a cheerleader who was dealing with pregnancy because they made fun of pregnant cheerleaders, she was pissed. And eventually they had to apologize on the PA to everybody. So that was my first foray into AIDS activism in high school before ACT UP, before anything. So that was probably
and coalition building.
Coalition built. Well, we didn't talk to each other, but the thing is, since I was the one who stormed out of the auditorium, members of the football team were supposedly all wanted to kill me, but nobody even said anything to my face about it. So that was my awareness. And then, as I got involved in youth groups, we started hearing it, and then I met people who had AIDS an AIDS diagnosis when I was still in high school, and it just went on from there, and
How did you happen to meet them? Were they older or were they other teenagers?
well, my first, I was depressed. I felt very alienated in high school, so I had strong suicidal thoughts. And after I got through that really dark period, I kind of reached out and started dealing with what was beneath it was I was gay and how to deal with that. So I hooked up with a gay youth group. And at my first meeting, they gave us this pamphlet about gay sexually transmitted diseases. And it was great on everything. And then I talked about this new disease caused by this virus, HTLV3. They weren't even calling it HIV yet. And had this crazy questionnaire. Are you at risk for AIDS? And it's like, no, I don't live in New York or San Francisco. No, I don't go to bathhouses more than 3 times a week. No, I don't have, this crazy number of sexual partners and all this other stuff. And it was this whole thing. I don't do drugs. And that was that. But then as, I went from Rhode Island Gay and Lesbian Youth and started meeting other people from other groups, I did meet a couple of older people who had an HIV diagnosis. And it was also around the time where they created Rhode Island Project AIDS. So, being that young, I didn't know anyone who died yet, but I did know a couple of people who were diagnosed. And it was something the community was talking about.
Yeah. As I hear that, the thing that I'm struck by is that your sexual coming of age and coming out was coincided with, the prevalence of AIDS or the beginning of AIDS, and it makes
Things
it so
hitting
difficult.
The fan.
Yes, and such a
Yes.
different way, and what should be a joyous time is a time of tension and concern.
It still was a joyous time. It was really amazing realizing that I'm not the only person in the world and not feeling isolated anymore and feeling good about being gay.
Yes.
Feeling good about gay sex, feeling good about being able to date other guys. So there was a lot of good things and a lot of empowering and wonderful things and making gay friends through both the Rhode Island Gay Youth Group and the Boston Alliance of Gay and Lesbian Youth and doing that. And that was an incredibly positive time, but this stuff was in the background. And since my friends from the youth groups came out within a year or two when I did and didn't have a long sexual history, I hadn't really experienced losing people yet. That came
Right.
a little bit later.
Right.
Not too much longer afterwards, but it came a little bit later.
Would you say, it sounds like you didn't feel helpless, but we all got angry at some point about what was going on, about the disease itself, losing friends. When did you first get angry?
Well, the first time I got angry was, again, at that talent show where people were just making these horrible AIDS jokes. And I just thought that was so offensive. And then, even though, but it was the Reagan administration. And although Reagan didn't mention the word AIDS until his final
Right.
year of his presidency, all of his advisors were saying things on television like AIDS is killing all the right people.
Right.
AIDS is not a problem. It's a solution to homosexuality. So it wasn't hard not to get angry. It's just what they're basically saying. And this is one reason why I really relate to a lot of the Black Lives Matter stuff today is, your government and the culture is just saying, my life is disposable. Not only do we not care if you die, we're kind of like quietly applauding in the background. And, and after, feeling so bad about myself before I came out that I contemplated suicide, I was furious. It's like, you people are making teenagers hate themselves so much that they would think about or even kill themselves, and you're doing this. It's like, this is, I was furious.
So you had this awareness when you were about 17 of the political situation, what Reagan wasn't doing and what everyone else was saying. You had a political analysis to it already, it sounds like.
It didn't take much analysis. When you have people who are Reagan's closest friends and advisors saying AIDS is killing all the right people. And, Designing Women did an episode at the time calling Killing All the Right People about that. It was like everybody was aware that that was something you'd hear again and again and again. AIDS is killing all the right people. It really didn't take analysis. It was right there in our face. And you could either put your head in the sand and ignore it, or you could, do something about it or get angry or something, you really had to be in denial not to understand that these people wanted us to die.
Yeah, I think, initially, I think a lot of people were in that kind of denial. How did you get to New York? When did you get to New York, and when did you get involved with ACT UP and Action Tours?
Aha. So after high school, I went to Rhode Island School of Design, and even though there were so many gay kids at the art school, most of them were closeted. So we kind of shared the same gay and lesbian student union with Brown University. So I was always on Brown campus in the office of the, then it was just the Lesbian Gay Student Alliance, and eventually they added the B and more recently the T.
Right.
One of the members of it was Steve Gendon, who was a founding member of... Yes. Well, Steve was, first off, he was on the national committee for the 87 March on Washington, which was in response to both the AIDS crisis and also the Hardwick ruling, where a gay man was arrested in his own bedroom for sodomy and sent to jail for consensual relations with his partner behind closed doors. The police just walked into his apartment over some sort of violation and not showing up for a court date for something minor, drinking in the streets. And they, it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, you can arrest and jail people for consensual sex in the privacy of their own bedroom. And so the march was on that, and Steve was the national coordinator for that. And shortly before the march actually happened, ACT UP New York was founded, and Steve was the person who wrote the working document. He was the one who proposed the whole direct democracy of the floor, all that other stuff. And he was going back and forth between Brown University and the Monday meetings in New York, and he created the first ACT UP chapter outside of New York in Rhode Island, and I was involved with that. And I was kind of getting disillusioned with the art world and art school, so I kind of left my sophomore year. And when I was deciding what I wanted to do, I was really, full force in ACT UP Providence and really excited about what ACT UP New York was doing. And I ended up moving to New York and, started going to ACT UP meetings my first week in New York. I went to the NIH action, like a few months before moving there. And the NIH action was like, okay, I want to go to New York. I want to do this stuff.
It's so good that you mentioned Steve Gendon, because he was so important. Just to have his name mentioned, if this is ever aired anywhere, people should Google him and find out a little bit about who he was, because he did a lot. I didn't know him, but he was an amazing guy.
Yeah, he really was, and I met him, even before the March on Washington, where the year before I went to RISD, he invited the gay youth group in Rhode Island, because most of the adult groups didn't want to go near the gay teen group, because they were afraid of being called pedophiles or whatever, and doing that. And so we were not included in things. And we had a really fight to say, hey, we exist, we need to be a part of the community. But they were doing a gay student conference, and Steve and this other guy, Christian Jarvin, reached out to us and invited us to attend, and then invited us to do things with them and stuff like that. So I met Steve before I even attended college, and he was an extraordinary person. And one of the most painful things about looking back at that time is some of the most extraordinary people I know in the AIDS movement passed away so many years ago that they're not included in these interviews and conversations.
People don't remember them. Their names are never mentioned aloud.
Because they died so soon,
Yeah, so I'm glad you mentioned him, because he was so important.
Well, without meeting Gendon, I wouldn't have moved to New York.
Good.
So, yeah.
ACT UP... Well, go ahead. I was just about to do that, but go ahead. Oh, it's, a lot of people don't know. They've heard of ACT UP. A lot of people haven't. Almost no one has heard of the Action Tours. Explain the relationship between them. Oh, I'm sorry.
Action Tours is the only affinity group in ACT UP to be in Weekly World News and People magazine. We were out there. Okay, so ACT UP is an acronym that stands for the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. In 1987, there was such an inaction happening around AIDS, and people were just frustrated and angry at the politics of it. That all the experimental drugs were just caught up in the bureaucracy of approval. People are being fired for being HIV positive. People like Pat Buchanan and a bunch of state legislatures were pushing bills and laws to have forcible quarantine for anyone who tested positive. I mean, things were really crazy, and a lot of the AIDS organizations were not doing stuff like that. So it was proposed to start a direct action group, to start focusing on the political part of AIDS rather than just caregiving and taking care of people. Action Tours. So when doing direct action, and this goes way back to the civil rights movement and before, people frequently form affinity groups, which is a small group of people within the larger protest that have an affinity for each other. And at a big protest, it's a great way of making sure everyone's looked after, no one gets arrested and disappears in the system, making sure there's support for each other, both emotionally, personally, in doing that. But then in some groups, you'll have an affinity group that will plan covert actions, which you can't announce at the public weekly meetings. And some affinity groups in ACT UP were just one-shot deals for a particular action. And then you had some standing affinity groups that would just meet and do protests on a regular basis. There were the Bloody Marys. Peter Staley's was the Power Tools, named after the porn movie. And ours was Action Tours. And in a maybe 3 or 4 year period, Action Tours did at least 200 actions. Some of them were really tiny. One person heckled Barbara Bush when she was doing a book signing at Macy's.
Oh, yes.
And then you had, some larger actions like the Santa action, like interrupting the CBS nightly news during the Gulf War, gagging the Statue of Liberty when Bush passed a gag order on Title X clinics, mentioning the word abortion, because half our members were also involved with WHAM,
Yes.
Women's Health Action Mobilization, which was an ACT UP focused on choice issues. So Action Tours was this affinity group in ACT UP. We met every Sunday just to talk about what's going on, what we wanted to do. And, since we had this diverse membership of men and women, we did things that were AIDS focused on ACT UP. We did things that were about women's choice, and we did things that were just LGBT. And sometimes we'd use different names. Like when we would do the abortion stuff, we would use the name Church Ladies for Choice or use WHAM's name. When it was AIDS, then we would say Action Tours affiliated with ACT UP and stuff like that. So, it was great. We would just meet every Sunday at James Wagner's apartment in Chelsea, and we would just brainstorm, or people from certain committees in ACT UP would approach us saying, this is what's going on. We want to know, do you want to do something? Do you want to help us plan an action? And that's kind of how we found you.
Yeah, it was, I'm going to say, and then we're done with this section unless you want to add something, but it was such a breath of fresh air when ACT UP came on the scene, because it gave a focus for the anger. It was channeled in a constructive way, and I love the fact that they weren't polite. They weren't waiting for anyone to give them something.
Well, we were desperate.
Yes.
It was like, the politeness wasn't working, and we were dying. And there was such an urgency like never before in the history of LGBT, oppression. It was just, people didn't know if they were going to be around next month. And one thing is, the Silence Equals Death poster that's so associated with ACT UP, that was actually created by Avram Finkelstein like months before the first meeting where ACT UP came about, where a group of artists and designers who were just frustrated about what was happening, they just said, what's happening? What are we going to do about it? And they were just saying silence equals death, where it's just all you're hearing is silence, and while we're dying and doing that. So they came with a poster, and that poster was popping up around New York, and it just resonated with people. And that's how people were feeling at the time. So when Larry Kramer gave his speech at the center when Nora Ephron canceled a speaking thing, and he spoke about the need to do this. That's why people were already in that headspace was, yeah, we need to make this happen. And March of 1987, ACT UP was formed.
Good. So we have to go more quickly.
Okay. So, Mark, what was going on in the world in the late 80s and the early 90s?
Well, it was, AIDS was in full swing, starting in around 82. I left San Francisco and went to architecture school in 83. By the late 80s, I mean, it was, there was still no relief. It was a death sentence. And by that time, enough friends had died. When I left architecture school in Los Angeles, I went to New York. I'd always wanted to live there, but I didn't want to go back to San Francisco, where all my friends were dying.
A lot of my friends said the same thing. They left. They either left New York or left San Francisco because of ghosts.
Yeah, it was too painful. And I went to New York, and of course I didn't know anyone there, and I had a reprieve for a while. Except I'd gone to New York for a couple of summers. One of my first good friends there died within 2 years, and that was the first death. I took care of him. But there was a sense of hopelessness. I wasn't involved politically. I'd given up on politics in San Francisco when the New Left, some organizations I was involved in that were mostly run by straight white men, didn't condemn Castro for his treatment of gay people at the time of the Mariel boat lift, around 1980. Mm-hmm. So I thought, fuck it. And I went to architecture school and moved to New York. So I was on the periphery of everything, except that I was HIV positive, and there was nothing to do.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to insert my own question. How do you find out you were positive? How did it go about for testing, or did you see a doctor?
Well, I moved to New York, and I moved in with this boyfriend, a guy I'd met during one of the summers there. And he was 10 years younger than I was, and he came home from work one day and said, I got tested today. And, it came back negative, and then I had to go get tested. And so I was tested, and I was positive. And I was 37. And because a clinic in San Francisco had done a test of blood they had on record of mine, I know I wasn't positive when I was 34. And I can pretty much place when I was infected and who infected me. But, it was like, at least but there's nothing you can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I remember at the time they were telling us, or Steve Gendon was telling us, unless you're symptomatic, don't get tested because there's no medication approved at that point. There's nothing you can do. The suicide rate of people who were testing positive was through the roof. And chances are, you're going to it's going to be a lot more problems. And it wasn't until '87 when they approved AZT and PCP for prophylaxis to prevent AIDS-related
Right.
pneumonia, that there was actually a reason to get tested earlier. Wow.
But I didn't take AZT for quite a while because it was such a potent drug. I started taking it right about the time that Macy's didn't hire me. So I waited about 4 years.
Yeah. So how and why did you first decide to apply for it? Because you were an architect. You had a really good
Yeah.
day job. Most of the people who apply for Macy's Santas are like out-of-work actors or people who are very unstable. So
Yeah,
why did you decide to do that?
Well, my stability's in question, but I was out of work. I had gone to California for about 3 months to take care of one of my best friends who was in a cabin on the Mendocino coast dying. And he needed someone to take care of him. And his social worker called me in New York. And I said, yeah, I can do that. So I went and helped him die. And then came back to New York, and I was just a mess. And I was so depressed. And I saw an ad in the Village Voice for Macy's Santas, and I thought, I'll apply for that. That would be a great job. I mean, I sort of always wanted to do it. I thought it would be fun, and I always wanted to be a cab driver. So I went to Macy's and I became Santa. And it was the best job I've ever had. And it really lifted my spirits.
Mm. What are some of the things that happened as Santa, like just one anecdote that really helped you deal with that loss?
Well, it was just the unconditional love. I mean, it was love for Santa, but I was the recipient. Little kids coming in and the wonder in their eyes, and old people coming back, and all sorts of things. Young couples coming in, everyone sitting on Santa's lap. And it was just magical. And then at the end of a shift, that year they were giving out these funny little paper crowns to kids.
Yes.
And I would walk out through the store, and all these little kids would be so happy wearing their paper crowns. And I thought I was part of that. I mean, it was just amazing. I've never been so loved.
I totally get that because after I came out, I had what turned out ringworm was like a fungal infection on my abdomen, but it was a big purple spot, and I was convinced it was KS. And so I didn't even want to see a doctor. I didn't want to do that. And then finally, when I saw a doctor, and for something else, I just said, well, what's this? And he's like, oh, that's just a fungal infection. I was just so angry because here I am, still in my teens, and I've lost that sense of immortality and wonder that you're supposed to have at that age. And it was just, I know from every gay man I know, it was just all that innocence and all that unconditional wonder and joy. AIDS just totally destroyed that in our lives. And I totally get that. It's one of the things that I was grieving the most about, losing.
That's what your generation suffered in a way that mine didn't.
Yeah, we never had that youth of being able to feel like immortal. I never thought I was going to live to be 40.
Yeah.
Never mind 54. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now what does Santa symbolize to you personally? Like, why Santa? Why not doing volunteer work at something else? Or
well, volunteer work, I mean, of any kind is good. But it was just that there's a magic to it. And at Macy's, the best Santa in the world. I mean,
yes.
But it was about being around that activity, about the kids, the magic that kids have for Christmas. It's just incredible. And I knew that, and I thought, this will pick me up. I've always liked kids. I've worked with kids. I've taken care of friends' kids. And, it's hard to be depressed when you're around an excited little kid.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know some of the other interviews you said that you were one of the more popular Santas. So what happened the next year? Did they invite you back Or did
They
you
did.
decide that you wanted? Oh, okay. What did they say when they invited you back?
Oh, they just, I think, sent me a message saying that, this was the day to come in for your physical and whatever. And so I went in on that day.
And then what happened?
Well, you take a very simple physical, and they ask you what drugs you're taking. And I don't think I was taking AZT before. If I was, the year before, I lied about it. But I thought, oh, I'm tired of lying. And you take a blood test also, and I didn't know what would show up in my blood. So I was just honest. I said I was taking AZT and Prozac. And the minute I said that, I knew I'd made a big mistake. The doctor's attitude changed. And
Did they? Was it specifically after AZT, or did they react to Prozac at all? Or
Well, I couldn't tell which one it was. I think it was AZT. That was, this is what our dispute was about in the suit. They would have said it was AZT, Prozac, but it was AZT. There was just the guy who was, our liaison above us as Santa was much different when I came back. And I don't remember what he said, but it was probably something like, "You'll hear from us." But it was a completely different tone.
And how do you feel when you kind of realized that they didn't want you now?
Well, it happened slowly. The year before, they notified you when to come for the first day of that year's training. And I kept waiting and waiting, and I didn't get notified. And I knew when the training started, so I showed up a little late. I walked into the room, and there was a kind of shock on the guy who was running the session on his face. And I was asked told that for some reason I couldn't sit in the session, to go home and to come back that afternoon to talk to an HR executive.
And
So
what
I
went
did
through
that.
your head as you were leaving?
I knew there was a problem, but I didn't know exactly what. I had my suspicions, but they hadn't been confirmed.
And how do you respond emotionally?
Oh, I was freaked out. It's like you have paranoias, and when they're confirmed, it's like partly it's a relief, but it's like, oh, fuck, sorry. It's like, oh.
Yeah. And what did you decide to do after that?
I went home.
Oh.
I was just about to get into that, but so what I did was I went back at the hour of the meeting. I went in to meet with this woman, and she had her hands on the desk very nicely, and she said, "We're not rehiring you because of the Prozac. We're afraid that you'll have violent outbursts with the children." And I protested that wasn't true. I'd never been violent. I loved children. And I said I thought it was the AZT. And she said no. And I don't know what happened then, but whether it was set up then or a day or so later, but I eventually met with a higher-up executive. But after that meeting, I walked down, I think, 8th Avenue, just, sort of out of my body in a fog, and I ran into Everett Quinton, and I just blurted, "What?"
Tell who
Yes.
Everett Quinton is. We love Everett Quinton. Had the first lawsuit to guarantee people can inherit the apartments that
Oh,
gay men
yes, I
could
forgot
inherit the
about that with
apartments. And
Charles Ludlam. You tell
Yes.
that because you know all the First,
Oh, my
let me
God.
tell you what he told me,
Yes.
and then you mentioned, because this is an important part of gay history.
We're all connected.
Yes. So I ran into Everett, and I blurted out what happened, and he just looked at me and he said, "You have to sue them." And, it took a while for that to resonate, but give a little bit of the history of Everett
Oh
Quinton.
my God! So there was this experimental theater writer and director, Charles Ludlam, who formed the Ridiculous Theater Company, which did a lot of cross-dressing roles, theater of the absurd. It was brilliant, and his longtime partner was Everett Quinton, who was in a lot of the plays. And
The sweetest man.
The sweetest man, and they were a couple, and as a couple living together as like a married couple for years. It was covered by the New York press. So when Charles Ludlam died in his rent-controlled apartment, the landlord tried to evict Everett, even though it was established that they're basically a married couple. And Everett sued, and that was the lawsuit in New York that said that with rent-controlled and rent-stabilized apartments, same-sex partners with an established relationship can inherit. Now, I didn't know this, but that's so incredible because Jamie Leo from Action Tours, who played such a huge role on this, had designed sets for the Ridiculous Theater Company and Everett Quinton, who and Everett used to go to my gym, the Chelsea gym, and I love Everett. He's brilliant. Oh, my God. Wow.
Yeah. So, anyway, that's what happened.
Wow.
He was a friend, not a good friend, but I knew him and we were friendly, and he was just a really nice guy. And I ran into him and I blurted out what was happening. And then what happened, I'll just go through this in a couple of sentences. What happened eventually was I went back to Macy's. I had another meeting with the vice president of HR, and he offered me a job they offered me a job as a straw boss in the Santa department, which was like $2 an hour more. And you wouldn't have the fun. I mean, it was just stupid. Why work for that amount of money if you're not going to have the fun? And so then this guy offered me a job as an architect at Macy's. And I thought, well, that would be the most boring job in the world. It wouldn't pay much. And I figure they'll fire me after 6 months. They just won't want me around. But basically, it would have been boring. So I said no. I said, I want to be Santa. And I think it's because of AIDS, and I'm not going to let it rest.
Were you ever consider yourself an activist before this?
I would go to demonstrations. I wasn't strategic, like during Watergate, I just screamed a lot and got rid of a lot of aggression. No, I wasn't an activist. I was a very shy private person.
So this was your first big activist thing that you did? Because the lawsuit, you were more of an activist than we were. Let's put that out there.
I'm not sure about that, but it's, it was a bigger issue than myself. If it hadn't been the issue like that, I probably wouldn't have fought it, but it just seemed too important.
Okay. And now it's your turn to ask me questions.
Oh, again?
Yes.
Okay. How did you first hear about my court case?
By luck. I wasn't reading the New York Times on a regular basis, but I was reading it during a lunch break the last week of August in 91, and there was a tiny blurb in the back of the paper about Mark Woodley. And with the Action Tours meetings, we would find things in the news, newspapers, people from other committees, and was like, what's going on? Do we want to do something about it? And I brought it in. I just said, I think this is really crappy. And we should do something. And I said at the time, but I really think we should dress up as Santa, and I think we should protest Herald Square. And I said my fantasy would be to do it on the day after Thanksgiving, Black Friday, the biggest shopping day of the year. And people seem to like the idea, but it's like, okay, it's August. We should wait a little bit. So we talked about it. People seemed responsive to the idea, and we tabled it for a little bit. Then probably in October, I brought it up again, and we planned it as a group and how we were going to do it. And that's how we found out about it. And we hadn't contacted you yet, and we hadn't done our own research, and we had our own take on what happened behind the scenes from ACT UP friends who worked at Macy's.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And, well, so that sort of tells me how it made you feel. You sprang into action. And what happened after that was the progression of planning the protest.
Well, when we do these roundtables, I mean, first off, I might have thrown out the idea for it, but it was a collaborative of thing. And Action Tours really functioned as a collective. So no protest was about one person. So someone would throw an idea out there. We'd all debate it, saying, do we want to go forward? And then we'd all contribute. So, like one of the first things we brought up, is this an important issue? And it's like, yeah, this really pisses us off. And then what do we really think we're going to accomplish on it? Or are we just speaking for the sake of our own stuff? Or is this going to have an impact? And at that point, when we were talking about it, we said, look, Macy's is never going to admit that they discriminate against somebody for having HIV, because that would open them up to much bigger lawsuits. Macy's was never going to hire Mark Woodley to work as Santa again. We knew that wasn't going to happen. But what we thought we might be able to do was the fact that because Macy's Santaland at the Herald Square flagship location is so big, and the day after Thanksgiving, and Macy's, Santa, 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 the movie Miracle on 34th Street, that we thought we could possibly garner enough attention to the issue that we could fire a loud warning shot that HR departments across the country would hear and pay attention to. And, we were hoping that at least we could get attention to this, and hopefully would have a better impact on people in the future, being afraid of hiring people with AIDS to work around children. And also, maybe it might help you out in your lawsuit with leverage or something like that. But we really didn't think we were going to change your situation that much. We thought it was mostly going to be just to make a bad example out of this, and to make sure other employers don't do the same.
Yeah. So what happened? I knew, and my lawyer, Margaret Winter, she had heard somehow. I don't know if I'd met Elizabeth yet, but we sort of knew that, or had an inkling that ACT UP was planning some sort of thing. We didn't know what it was. And during the course of the lawsuit, she became a good friend. So we were down at her mother's house in D.C. for Thanksgiving. We were out of New York. And we only found out the day, in Saturday in the paper, what had happened. Wow. What happened on the day of the protest? How did it transpire?
Well, let's go back a little bit before. So one of the reasons ACT UP was so successful and Action Tours is we really did our homework. We didn't just have a superficial, Wikipedia type knowledge of an event and then just do something half-assed. We did our own research. We really did that. So we had someone in ACT UP who everyone in Action Tours was friends with but wasn't active in Action Tours, was a longtime employee at Herald Square. And we asked him what was going on and what he knew about it. So he asked around, and he said that, on a store level, for the full-time employees, the HR department was actually really good in dealing with people who had HIV. But he said that, from what he gathers from quietly sending out feelers, was that the people who run Santaland, like the people who work at Santaland, it's a seasonal thing. They're not full-time people. So instead of going to HR and having the people who normally deal with this, when, I guess now when your doctor freaked out, whatever, they went up to corporate, who doesn't deal with it. And then the corporate people decided, we don't want him. And, so it was mishandled, and it was handled very differently than the way they handled their full-time year-round people. So at that point, we decided, do we still want to go ahead? And we were like, yeah, this is a bigger thing. And we really didn't want to hurt you or your lawsuit. So somebody from the group reached out to either you or your lawyer. I think it was Elizabeth, who is this older woman who came into ACT UP through women's pro-choice activism. And
she might be younger than I am.
I don't know, but she can't remember if she was the one who spoke to you, but she was kind of like a den mother to everybody.
Yeah,
She was
I
she was
think
incredible.
she was the first person I talked
And
to, but I
and
don't know
she
if it was before the
we
protest.
reached out to either you or your lawyer. One person reached out to either you or your lawyer, and we heard right off was that there can't be any coordination. You can't know what's happening in ACT UP because that could endanger your lawsuit, and we didn't want to do that. And we kind of decided beforehand that if either you or your lawyer was dead set against us doing this, we would not do it. But someone reached out to your camp, and they said, well, we can't officially know what's happening, but if you do it, go do what you want to do. So we kind of got an okay that, well, we don't want to know about it. We don't want to do it. And so then we went ahead. So what happened? We investigated. We found cheap Santa suits for $25 each at a novelty store. We made, instead of doing our normal fact sheet that we hand out to people, we made them in the form of Christmas cards that had a little Santa illustration with HIV positive written on his beard. And it said, when Santa had HIV, Macy's fired Santa. Then on the inside, the text was titled "A Tragedy on 34th Street," and we collaboratively wrote a Christmas carol about your your story.
I know. Yes.
Yes. So yeah, we all planned this out, and we got up really early in the morning. We met at the ACT UP workspace. There was a lot of other people who weren't Action Tours regulars, but who joined us. And it was this very diverse group of people, men and women, white people, people of color, handicapped, disabled, who were all, including a dwarf. And I love the fact that when I read the Santaland Diaries from David Sedaris, he was saying that if you're under 5'10", you're a dwarf. If you're over 5'10", you might be a Santa. And we had a dwarf, but he was a Santa, not a dwarf. We didn't have any Mrs. Claus. Everybody was a Santa. Action Tours doesn't discriminate like Macy's.
Yes.
And so we, the ACT UP workspace wasn't too far from Macy's, so we all got dressed there. We had chains wrapped around our waist with padlocks in our sleeves, and we met on the Herald Square side of Macy's, started singing regular Christmas carols, like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, started walking in. Everyone's cheering and clapping because they think this is so cute and adorable. We get into the middle of the cosmetics aisle, and chains come out of our sleeves. We chain ourselves together in a circle facing outward. And then we start singing the Mark Woodley Christmas Carol and start handing out the flyers, and then it just went from there. I don't know if I want to sing it now, but it was,
I won't sing it because it would assault people's ears. But...
Yes. Well, it's Santa Claus has HIV. Fa la 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 la
Fa la
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 la.
la. Macy's won't rehire he. Fa la 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 la. They thought Mark Woodley's the best. Fa la 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 la. Till he took an HIV test. Fa la 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 la. Discrimination is illegal. Fa la 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 la. We all think Macy's is evil. Fa la 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 la. They best hire Mark Woodley back. Fa la 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 la. Otherwise, we'll ACT UP, fight back. Fa la 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 la. And we start doing that, and this little kid goes to her mother, "What's happening?" And they're like, "Macy's fired Santa. Macy's is bad." And like Macy's, it was like one of the perfect actions because Macy's didn't know what to do. Because on one hand, they wanted us out of there because it was going to make them look horrible. But on the other hand, the last thing Macy's wanted to do after the national coverage of the parade and the biggest shopping day is to begin their holiday season with Santa being dragged out of Macy's in handcuffs on the evening news and in the local papers, which is what happened. So the store representatives went up to us and they're like, "Oh, we hear your point. We get what you're doing, and we support, the fight against AIDS. So if you leave now, we promise we're not going to call the police." We're like, "Well," I said, "I'm chained to 21 other people. I can't really go anywhere. I don't have I don't have the keys to these locks." And they're like, "No, really. We won't arrest you if you leave now, and it'll all be good, and we'll talk about it. We'll make sure, we're not going anywhere." So at first they started putting up those cloth, screens that say, "Please pardon our parents," while we're remodeling, and they try to block us off with that. Then this amoeba of Santa starts weaving in and out of the cosmetics aisles to avoid that. So finally they are stuck and they had to call the police. So the police surround us. So we sit down, and then the police start cutting our chains with bolt cutters and dragged us out of the store. And there was photos in the papers of Santa being dragged out of Macy's in handcuffs. And, and that was great. It was exactly what we wanted.
And in the article in the Post the next day, there was a quote of a kid saying to its parent, "They're arresting Santa."
Yes. Well, that was the kid we were talking about. We're just like, yeah, they're arresting Santa. And it's like, well, Macy's fired Santa. Macy's is bad. It was, yeah. So it really got the coverage we wanted. It was fun. That was a really interesting thing about Act Up is like a lot of Act Up was laughing and crying at the same time.
Yes.
We had a lot of energy. We were empowered. We were supportive of each other. We felt invincible. We were dating each other. We were hanging out together. We had all this fun. We had a sense of humor in our stuff. But at the same time, the backdrop was people we loved were getting sick and dying. So it was this, I think it was a great action in terms of just really capturing what it was like at that time where, we were humorous, we were creative, but at the same time, what's behind it? What was behind it was really horrible.
Is there a way that it was uniquely effective as opposed to other actions?
Yes.
Or
I think it was from tactics. It was like one of the only times where we got our opponent in checkmate, where no matter what they did, they were screwed badly.
Yeah.
Where again, it was such a great move on our part because if Macy's let us stay there, more media would show up and it would be worse and terrible. But at the same time, if they called the police, that was also going to be bad. And it was just Macy's was put in this position where like, no matter what we do, we're screwed. And the store representatives who were talking to us, you could just hear it in their voices where like, we are so effed right now. We can't, it's like, please just make this end. So we kind of knew that it was like that. And it was, and when you did these really colorful, creative things, you get a lot of cheers on the floor of Act Up and, it made people really feel good about it. And we all had fun. It was a fun, it's not fun getting arrested, but, in terms of the whole everything, it was really one of the more fun actions we did, and it was great. Yeah.
And it ultimately helped my lawsuit. I think it was a big help in that it made Macy's take it seriously, and they were worried. It dragged on for 5 years. They were worried a little every Christmas that something would happen.
Oh, you could hear it in their voices when they were dealing with us. They were like, "Oh, F, we're screwed. This is bad." Well, that was one of the formulas. One of the formulas going back to the Black Civil Rights Movement of direct action is to make the cost of doing nothing greater than the cost of keeping the status quo. And that was the formula of this. We wanted to make the cost of Macy's allowing you to be fired, to discriminate into doing this. We want to make that cost greater than to either to settling with you and for people not to do this going forward. And it worked very effectively.
It did. That's the end of my questions.
So we were, so we were all sitting on the floor, and the police came around with bolt cutters, and it takes a while, and then we decided beforehand that except for anybody who has a disability where being dragged would possibly injure them, that we were just going to go limp and let them carry us out of the store, and that was the picture in the paper. And at the time, the precedent for nonviolent civil disobedience was you'd get a desk appearance ticket, so you get pulled down to the station. We made sure that you have a good number of both men and women because they separate people, and you don't want people. If you had like one woman and a arrest, you don't want that one person going through the system alone because that's not good. And although like one of the Santas was this girl Jane, who was more masculine presenting, and they tried to put her in the van with the men, and we thought it was funny. The police were so clueless, and we weren't a threat to society or anything like that. So instead of holding us overnight till we saw a judge, they gave us desk appearance tickets, which at the time before Giuliani was kind of what New York did. So you get a desk appearance ticket, and they're like, well, you're not a threat to society. You're a good citizen. You don't have a criminal record, so we're going to give you a desk appearance ticket so you and your lawyer can appear in court on this date, and the judge will give you a date for your hearing, and then do that. And so we did that. We got our date, and then we got what they call an ACDC, adjournment for contemplation of dismissal, meaning that you spent the day in jail, like 6 hours or so. So and you weren't harming anybody. You were doing this for a good cause. So if you don't do anything wrong for the next 6 months, we'll seal your record like it never happened. So everyone involved in it, we got an ACD. So the records were sealed, 6 months after the arrest. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now you talked a little bit about how you kind of heard about it from your lawyer. So once you saw everything that happened, what was your reaction? And like how did it make you feel? Like what did you think about this?
Well,
and do you remember where you saw it?
We saw every New York paper, and the art. We went out and got them once we heard about it. And the article that I remember is the one that was in the Post because it was the most colorful. And I was, first of all, I was so flattered that you guys had taken the time, even though I knew, the reason I was in the case was for the bigger issue about workers' rights. But we were just laughing. It was so funny. It was so hilarious. You guys had been so strategic and smart. And, there was... I was laughing last night thinking about it again. Yeah, it was like, this is a good thing. They'll pay attention to this. It's a little different than our legal appearances, and Margaret had to do some legal footwork to establish our ability to hear it in court, other than I'd gone to some employment commission originally and realized I was in the wrong location when the woman who was the sort of the agent for the agency or the official asked me to say hello to Macy's vice president of human resources, the guy who hadn't rehired me. She said, "Oh, I worked on a case with him. Tell him hello if you see him," because he was this really good-looking guy. And I thought, oh, she has a crush on him. And if she's asking me to say hello to the other side, I'm in the wrong place. So I got a lawyer. And because I'd gone to that commission at first, Margaret had to do a little work so that we could file in the court.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said that before that, when you wanted to be Santa basically to bring yourself joy during holidays, and then Macy's took that away from you. So how did seeing this on the day after Thanksgiving, how did that impact your holidays that year?
Well, I still wasn't Santa Claus. And I had the first article that came out, I happened to look at it today. It was written by David Margolick in the Times, and it came out on the 29th of August. And so there was all this publicity. There was all this attention. My phone was ringing. I became known as AIDS Santa. I wound up still working as Santa. I've forgotten which organization bought me a Santa suit. And I started going to various organizations with people with AIDS, and I was Santa. Mm-hmm. And the best place was, I think it's Downstate Hospital in Brooklyn. There was an amazing doctor there who had a pediatric AIDS clinic. And so I started, for the next few years, going there to be Santa for these little kids with AIDS. And that was more incredible than being Santa at Macy's in a way, because there were kids that probably had a very short life expectancy. They hadn't gotten up to speed with treating pediatric AIDS yet, and yet they were living in the present. They were interested in Christmas. They were excited about Santa, and it taught me a whole lot about living in the moment.
Also, at the time, like there were kids who were being barred from school for having HIV,
Yes.
and I'm sure it meant a lot
Yes.
to them to also have a Santa who had HIV.
The kids that were old enough to be aware of that, some were, but most of them were pretty young. Kids
Okay.
weren't living that long yet.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I maybe saw one kid that was like 9 or 10, but they were all, little kids. Well, how hardworking and committed this one doctor, whose name I can't remember, was just amazing. And everyone who worked there was so committed to these kids. And, some of them were patients in the hospital, some were in an outpatient clinic. Parents would come. And it was not at a time when AIDS was seen as a death sentence, and it was a hopeless thing, and it was grim. There was none of that attitude with these kids. I mean, there were some kids who were obviously so sick when they came to see Santa. It was clear that they were not doing well. But other kids, it was fine. And whatever problems they had with the disease didn't stop them from just being kids. They were kids first and foremost, and they happened to have AIDS. And it was inspiring.
Now, at the time it happened, there was a lot of negative backlash, especially when it came to people with AIDS interacting with kids. Like there were some 3 hemophilic brothers in Florida who, when they
Yes.
sued to not be barred from school, their house was burnt down.
Yes.
Did you receive any any negative stuff from people who are like, no, we don't want one of those people near our kids? Or
Yes, and I can't remember it specifically. I mean, what's interesting, my phone was listed in the phone book, and I thought I would have phone calls at home that were, crank calls or critical. I didn't get any of them. Where I would get backlash would be I went on various TV shows, and I would go on radio programs, and there would be call-ins where I would take questions, and that's where I would get homophobic responses. And I can't remember specifically what people would say, but it would basically be that, I shouldn't have anything to do with kids, or I don't think anyone told me to die. But there was real anger, and I got a pretty good response to them, and I can't remember what it was. It was sort of like an understanding voice that said, "Wow, I hear a lot of anger in your voice," or something like that. But it.
yeah,
No, it. The most negative effect was, as part of Discovery, Macy's had all my psychiatric records from St. Vincent's Hospital. And so they would release things to the news media that made me sound debauched. It made me sound like a heroin addict. They dealt with the fact that I was recovering alcoholic, although they didn't say recovering. They they talked about I don't know what, they knew everything. I can't remember what they brought up or put out in little, news things and little sound bites. But that was the hardest thing.
yeah.
The inference that I was crazy.
Yeah. Now, what impact do you think that these events, your lawsuit, the action towards zapping Macy's, what do you think that really did for the larger cause of AIDS discrimination?
Well, I think it raised it raised issues of transmission that you can't get AIDS by sitting on Santa's lap. You can't get it from talking to somebody. That people with HIV and AIDS are pretty safe in the workplace. I was surprised that, several years, as many years into the epidemic as we were, that people still thought that.
10 years.
Yes, that I thought people were over that. I was so surprised. And so I think it really, in, your action, all of this stuff, it's just, you can't, not just that you can't get AIDS from those people, but if you fire them, you're liable to run into trouble.
Yes.
That there are consequences. Whatever you think is one thing, but your actions have to toe the line with, labor laws. It's probably under, what was it, the People with Disabilities Act?
Yeah, I think that got passed a year or so after. But one thing that's been killing me this past year during COVID is all those conservatives who are the ones who are like, tattoo them, put them in, concentration camps, force quarantine for all people with AIDS, even though it was impossible to casually transmit. This year, now that you have a disease, which you can spread to somebody standing 20 feet away by breathing the same air, they're like, freedom, 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 no mask. Oh, this is oppressive. And it's like, oh, I remember what you were saying 30 years ago, and you are such a crazy hypocrite, And that's really pissed me off this year.
I don't want to get into this. There's too much to talk about.
Too much.
The moment.
Okay.
We can talk about it later, but
we will. Oh God. Okay, now your turn for questions.
Oh, okay. Well, I have the same question for you. Why was this protest and all of the others that you did so crucial to the movement as a whole?
I think it really goes back to the whole silence equals death meme, where, it really was, before ACT UP, there really was silence. Gay people did not have a seat at the table for deciding their own fate, whether it was in legislatures, whether it was in AIDS clinical trial groups, insurance companies, employment, or whatever. And it was really this incredible period where we were not only demanding to be treated better, but demanding that, we have a place. We need to be here. We need to be a part of these decisions. And I think we really broke the vacuum of silence, first off, in a huge way, where we forced the media and the public to talk about AIDS when they really didn't want to talk about it. And we really forced and demanded our place at the table and took it. So I think going forward, you really don't see discussions of HIV, LGBT issues where we are not included in those discussions. And I think that was huge. And again, the Americans' disabilities. At the table. We got to play. And that's the biggest thing, though, is like, if you're not in the room when decisions are being made, you're screwed. And
the treatment action group was a big part of that.
Yeah, a lot of these things. And, and that's true with any issue. And the stuff I did afterwards, it's still, you need to have an equal place at the table. And so I think that's our biggest thing. And we really, I look at the stuff we did in Action Tours, and, we were very colorful. We had a lot of published writers, artists, designers, and creative people in Action Tours. So we did these crazy, colorful, theatrical zaps that were really impossible for the media to ignore because they were just so visually, they made great news. And so we were really very good and successful at generating conversation on issues where, and changing the way they would talk about issues on things that the media either was ignoring or, trying to frame it in a way we didn't want the issue framed.
Yeah.
And,
The other thing I would say that ACT UP did was it gave people an outlet. away people with HIV and AIDS and people who were sympathetic. It gave them a way to fight. It gave them a way to stand up as part of the group and make their voices heard. I mean, the fact that the organization went international says a lot about how people reacted to it, the impact it had.
One of our mantras was anger into action, where we were feeling all this anger. And below this very surface anger was this very, very deep grief and pain. And ACT UP gave us a productive way of channeling that and into something where you didn't feel so helpless. You felt like you were making a difference. And,
Yeah.
you know, that, yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, on the political side, it did everything you said. On the social side and the political part of that, it gave people a way to make their voices heard as part
Social
of the group.
side. The best
Well,
cruising in New York
Oh,
was
I
at
know.
the ACT UP's Monday meeting.
The cutest men were at ACT UP. And it was
And-
so crowded you couldn't get a seat.
Yes,
And I
you
don't
couldn't get a
like
seat.
crowded rooms. I never went because I'm agoraphobic. But
But yeah, no, we had great social. We did a lot of social things. Action Tours did a lot of social things together that had nothing to do with HIV. Also, because we were such a zeitgeist at the moment, all the club promoters were giving us free invites to get into their club nights for free. So you know, like we got through every Velvet Rope and K nightlife. It was a fun time. You know, it was great social stuff. Aside from the fact that we were doing all these important issues. And we were sluts.
Yeah,
we cruised
well,
a
yeah.
lot.
So even though you came of age at the beginning of age, you wound up having a lot of fun.
Yes, and ACT UP helped us find the life, the joy, and like really finding all of this good stuff in the midst of all this death.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I found Santa and you got laid. It's
A little more than that, but yes.
somehow
yes, I
all
did.
these years later it doesn't seem
Yeah,
fair.
so I was like, well,
So ultimately, how did all of these events and all of this action, this activity, the political stance, how did it impact you? How did it affect your life?
well, first off, it taught me that, ACT UP did some demonstrations where you had thousands of people in the street, but with Action Tours, we did these smaller actions, with just a handful of people. I mean, Macy's was a little bit larger, 22 arrests, and maybe about 10 or 15 people doing support work. But we do these small events that would make national news, that would get coverage in, like national and even international media. And it really taught me that, okay, you don't need, 1,000 people or whatever. You can be heard. You can make yourself impossible to be ignored. And, you are not as helpless in life as you might think. And also that, I really do have the power to, change things. And that, also it's just that, history is always happening and you can either be involved with it or you can just not be involved with it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was a really creative thing. And I met some of my best friends, my oldest friends. I met all these creative, incredible people who I would not have met otherwise. And, it was just this incredible experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it did change my life for a lot of things. And yeah. Okay, sorry.
No, that's okay. It's this next question is in what ways were we bonded by that experience?
My relationship with you is a little odd because you were 42 at the time. I was 24. The first time he came to Action Tours, I thought, oh my God, he's a handsome guy. But we didn't really have this because of your lawsuit, whatever. You weren't actively involved in Action Tours. You came to the meeting after the action, and
Oh, that's
as
right.
a guest, because we always did like the week or two after we would talk about the action, what happened, kind of celebrate what we did, and also just give a critique on how things went. And you showed up at it and was like, oh my God, he's a real person now, because you were only somebody who I knew through the media.
Yeah, I went to thank you, I think.
Yes. And, so it's a weird thing, though, because, we traveled in different social circles. So you're not someone I socialized with, but, at the same time, I feel a very strong emotional connection to you, your fate, how this thing, impacted my life, how we impacted your life. And, and I really do have this really deep affection and, psychic connection with you. And first
I
off,
feel the same way.
First off, I just want to say I'm so grateful that I'm talking to you 30 years later
Yes,
at 72, because too many friends are not around. And
exactly.
anyone from that time who's around, the first thing that goes through my head is I'm just so grateful they're still here. And
This is when I
you're-
might cry.
Yeah, and you're someone who I really do have a lot of love for,
Yeah, I feel the same way about you. I mean, I do remember just how vital and how much energy you had. And
That's changed.
well, we should get together. You would feel pretty energetic next to me. And I remember going to a party at your house, at your apartment up near
No,
Columbia.
that was James Wagner's.
Okay, well, I remember going to that party and you were there.
Okay,
And this
yeah.
has to go in the official record because I've told it to you and to everyone else. And everyone had been in drag at some event. And I said, I hadn't been in drag since I was in San Francisco. And I said, oh, could you put me in drag? You know what I'm going to say, I think, unless you've forgotten. And you said,
No.
yes, but, I asked if you could, get me up in drag. And you said, yes, but you'd look matronly. And
Well, one of the offshoots of
that just crushed me.
well, one of the now I'm very matronly. I mean, I was back then. Bush was president, and there was a couple of events where I dressed up as Barbara Bush, and it took me 2 hours to do the makeup to look older. Now it just falls into place.
Yeah.
But one of the offshoots of Action Tours was Church Ladies for Choice, which was kind of a
Yes, with
quasi drag
Elizabeth.
performance thing with Elizabeth
Yes.
going to do clinic defense dressed up as church ladies. And
Yes.
so it was probably us in our church lady mode, and we weren't doing realistic drag. This was not RuPaul's Drag Race. It was very campy, gender fuck,
Right.
like messy drag. It was fun. It was a lot of fun.
I want to. Maybe you have a question similar for me about bonding. If so, I won't say anything about it now. But I have similar feelings for you, and I'll either express them now or later in a question.
Please express them now.
Well, I was so taken with you, how smart you were, how strategic you were, how nice you were. You were so cute. And what? We weren't friends, but I had so much respect for you, and I was just fond of you immediately. And, I've been in Amsterdam for 10 years now, but occasionally, I look at your Facebook page or it comes up in the algorithm. And so I've kept touch with you a little bit, that you're a photographer, that you left New York and went to Rhode Island, that you're a baker, that you have a boyfriend now or a long-term relationship. And so your
Who wasn't
life
born
seems...
when this happened. He was born a year after the action.
It's maddening, isn't it?
Maddening.
Now you know how I feel. This is...
God.
We're going... Well, there's an anecdote I'll tell you later about going to a protest here. And, I went to a few protests after that. Because of the lawsuit, I could not be too closely allied with ACT UP. But the respect I had has always remained. And I've watched you go from this kid into this, fabulous man who, you've made a nice life for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really nice to see. I mean, that's the best thing that can happen.
Thank you.
And you never burned out on politics.
I did a few times. I eventually came back, and it was during the summer of '93. It was like the '93-'94 period is when a lot of people I knew started dying in a large group. There was one summer where I lost 6 friends in like a 2-month period, and that's when things really were bad for me. I just crashed, and a lot of it was just like, what am I doing? Does any of this activism really mean anything? All the people I know are dying. I tried counting the number of people who I knew in my life. So the rule was, counting people who went to the gym, neighborhood friends, exes, things like that. No celebrities on TV. And I stopped after I got to like 350 people. And I there's probably more than 500 people who intersected my life who are dead. And, I just crashed. And, part of the question I kept asking myself is like, for all the things I didn't act up that were making a difference, being involved in the first political funeral where people who died willed their ashes to be deposited on the White House lawn. And that action was the cause of AIDS being brought up at a presidential debate for the first time ever. And, so you could see things that I worked on that actually had these things, but there were all these larger meta changes and nothing involved with the people in my life. So one of the things I did look at that did give me some hope was the Santa action where, it did help somebody who I knew, and it did have my work did have an impact on somebody who I knew and cared about. And that meant a great deal during that crash period. But I went through multiple crashes and burnouts because it's just it's just emotionally exhausting. But yeah.
Can I ask you a question all these years later, and this will be the last one, this is not on the list, but how do you find the mourning process all these years later for people who've been dead 30 or 35 years?
I sometimes walk in New York and see a familiar face out of the corner of my... I sometimes walk down the street and see a familiar face out of the corner of my eye, and then I just catch myself thinking, oh, this person died 25 years ago. And you're just haunted by stuff like that. Also, like during that period where like other friends from ACT UP call it, oh, that year everybody died. It was just happening so fast that, one person dies, and then before you can process their death, somebody else is in the hospital or doing this. So you didn't have time to fully process their death. And I find myself in recent years going back and dealing with all this unresolved grief that you just never had an opportunity to deal with because it was just this like, one after another. And it's just, how do you deal? So you just shut down and just kind of try just to get through the day and not really do all the processing. And then you look back and it's just staggering. So I'm still dealing with it. I don't think I'll ever not be dealing with it. And as much as I live in the present and, know that AIDS is not the fatal disease as it was back in 91, I think there's always one foot of mine that's always going to be in those plague years. And that's something I'll never leave behind. And it's very weird. I'm HIV negative, but I never thought I was going to live to be 40, never mind 54. And also, like, when discussions of the plague years come up, and I'm talking with millennials who are HIV positive, I think that, I have a bigger connection to that aspect of AIDS than they do because they don't, have any living memory of watching all your friends die. All your friends get horribly sick, suffer. I mean, the way people were dying of AIDS back then was it was a horrible death. Whether it was the pneumonia, the blindness, all this stuff. KS, so your legs were so swollen, it was painful to walk. The wasting away where somebody 1 week they would look like a gym god, then a couple weeks later there would be a living skeleton. And it was just, and it's crazy though. And I always try to, tell people that although I'm HIV negative, I'm living with HIV because it just was, it was just such a big part of my life, and it just really caused so much damage, so much pain, so much scarring, and so much everything that, that I live with HIV even though it's not in my body. Yeah. What about you?
It's basically the same. I mean, there's the thing of everyone who died. I mean, when you were talking, I was thinking of this guy I took care of in Greenwich Village, who I met at, a program for people with AIDS, and I didn't know him. I just started going to his house as a buddy, helping so many people die. And I think of two sort of loves of my life who died, one 37 years ago and the other one about 35 years ago. And sometimes I think of them and the grief is so sweet, but other times there's such pain that they didn't get to live a full life the way I have, and so many friends. I left LA, went to New York. I wasn't involved with all my friends who were dying in San Francisco. And 2 years ago, I got in touch with various friends from San Francisco who were still living. And they came over at different times to stay with me here in Amsterdam. And we caught up, and there were memories, because my life has been compartmentalized enough that there's no one to talk to about the people I knew and lost. I can tell people, but they didn't know them. And so
How do you tell people about that? I mean,
well, you
well,
you tell
have you
them
ever,
about what? Well, you can't.
I'm sorry, but
Go ahead.
I've asked millennials. It's like, well, how many people do you think I've lost to AIDS? And they're like, maybe 10 friends. And it's like, no, higher, 25. And then it's like, and they still, like, even watching these ACT UP documentaries and all the stuff that's been coming out in the past couple of years, they have no clue. And it's like, no, let's talk about mid three figures. You're talking like probably more than 500 people I know, or who intersect my life, either friends or acquaintances, people in the neighborhood, people at the gym, people from ACT UP. There's about 500 people who were in my life who are dead from AIDS. And they can't wrap their heads around that. So how do you talk to them about it?
Well, statistics are hard. I always make it personal. I talk about an individual, the way that you talked about Steve Gendon, which brings it to life, that somebody who was so vital died and didn't get a chance to live. And
Well, the kid who founded my gay youth group, I had 2 dates with him. We didn't really date, but it was just like one date or whatever. But he died exactly one day before his 30th birthday, and that's something that always stuck in my head. One day, but I mean, he never got to real. I mean, it just
The point I was making about these friends coming over 2 years ago was, all of a sudden I was involved with people who knew the people I'd lost. We'd all lost them, and I got to sort through a lot of feelings there. And there were memories I'd forgotten. They wound up being fuller in my remembrance after hearing these friends talk about them.
ACT UP did go through a period like that where it was starting with our 25th anniversary, and then after that, when Spencer Cox, who was very involved with the Treatment Data Committee, he died. And what happened with him was a lot of people, because of using all this monotherapy, the new treatments didn't work for them because their bodies were resistant. And that was Gendon. Yeah. Gendon died years after the first cocktail, but I guess his body was resistant to the drugs in that cocktail from using them as single drugs, and so he died. But Spencer, just going from being on top of the world with being like one of the leading AIDS activists, everyone loving him, to being more socially isolated and doing this, he didn't tell anyone. He stopped taking his AIDS meds, and he died of AIDS. And that was such a shock to everybody from ACT UP that it really started a big conversation amongst those surviving about grief, about supporting each other, and about all this compartmentalized baggage we're all dealing with. And that horrible tragedy really started us talking about our own post-traumatic stress disorder, unresolved grief, serial loss. And we've had a lot more healthy conversations and been a lot more supportive of each other, and a lot of people reconnected on an ongoing basis after Spencer's death. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good to have someone to acknowledge your shared history and someone who knows it and went through it with you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's all I have for.
Yeah, okay.
Well, go ahead.
So, well, you already said.
What were you going to say?
No, but you're right. It's just, like when you go through such a traumatic event, it's really hard for people who weren't part of it to really understand, because it was such a crazy, crazy time.
I have two more questions for you that I sort of got off track with this other stuff.
Sorry.
Why does this story resonate 30 years later? Or does it?
It does. You mean resonate with the public or myself or I think with the public.
With the public, with other people. We know why it resonates with us, but to the public at large.
Because it's hysterically funny.
History.
It's hysterically funny. I mean, it's really, again, what Action Tours... What Action Tours was
the question.
Well, what Action Tours was very good at is finding these fabulous theatrical, over-the-top ways of talking about or, portraying an issue that were just too compelling for the media to ignore, even if they wanted to ignore it. And this was a great example of it, where, the whole image of 22 Santas in Macy's getting arrested and dragged out, on the busiest shopping day of the year, when, Macy's had just did a national broadcast with their Santa on TV and all this other, it's just so funny. And I think it's just such a colorful action, and it just shows ACT UP's wit, our political power, our everything. I mean, it's just a really funny action. And when people hear about it, they're like, you got to be kidding. It's like, no, really, this happened. And I show them the New York Times article. Yeah.
And it and all of what ACT UP did is a roadmap for people who might want to protest some issue today.
Yeah, well, that's one of the things which I've argued with some of the people when doing the marriage protests is like, ACT UP's first action where they went down to Wall Street and they were lying in the streets, that got a lot of attention because it was the first time gay people were protesting against AIDS and getting arrested. But then after that, it's like old news. You keep doing the same thing again and again, and it's like, oh, they're getting arrested in the street again. What else? So it's like trying to find colorful ways to both get your message across and also to make a scene that the media cannot ignore. Where Get Equal during the whole marriage thing and Don't Ask, Don't Tell, they got arrested at the White House fence. And I kept telling them, it's like, you can't just keep going to the White House fence. It was interesting the first time, but you're going to get decreasing coverage. You have to find new ways of it and find ways, aside from change, that really, where the protest itself will tell what the story is and what the issue is without even, you doing it. And having us, dress up as Macy's really told your story. Aside from, the press releases and us talking about it. It wasn't just us getting arrested at Macy's. It was Santa versus Macy's. And that's how it framed the issue. So, it is a roadmap. And it's about being strategic. And I think that's what doesn't get enough coverage in a lot of the retrospective stuff on ACT UP is that we really did do the deep research. We researched and we got information on what was happening behind the scenes for Macy's. We send someone to reach out to talk to you. We really try to understand it more than what was in that New York Times article in August. And that was the roadmap. And we thought very strategically where, where would Macy's be most sensitive? What's the way of doing this? How do we communicate this? And, yes.
Have people lost their sense of humor?
I don't think so. I still think there are protests today that have a sense of humor in doing that. And depending on the issue, I mean, obviously with the Black Lives Matter thing, with people being murdered, I would not use the humor of the Santa action for that. But yeah, I would use theatrical things to articulate it. And I think that's possible. So I think some people never had a sense of humor. And even back then, there were some people amongst gay activists who hated what ACT UP did and thought we were hurting the cause, and they didn't get the sense of humor. But I think humor is a great humor, amongst other things, is a great tool to use to manipulate the media, and we used it. We consciously and strategically used humor as a tool for the message on this action.
But a lot of the people that objected to what ACT UP did were people that wanted to be invited to join the club of, establishment society at large.
I think, but I think a lot of gay people, you look at before then about like what kind of gay people were accepted. And it was kind of the gay equivalent of mammies, where, if the gay person was existing only to take care of straight people, to be a society woman's escort at an event her husband doesn't want to go to be your hairdresser, to be your clothing designer, to be your florist. We could do these things as long as we don't talk about our issues, our relationships, and doing this. So I think a lot of gay men at the time bought into that, the way to be accepted is to, just blend into the background. Don't talk about being gay. Even if everybody knows we're gay, we're not going to talk about it. We're not going to do that. And we need them to accept us, and we need not to scare the horses. And I think AIDS really shook us up, really realizing that, if we keep going down this path, we're going to die, and we need to do more. So there's a lot of people who didn't appreciate it. But the thing is, ACT UP got results. Where suddenly, we had meetings with people who were never going to give us meetings before. The reason you had the first White House meeting with Clinton was because the late Bob Rafsky interrupted him at campaign appearances. The Ashes Action political funeral, that was the reason AIDS was brought up at the presidential debate for the first time. So the fact that we were getting results is really hard to deny, but still you had some people who were like just too afraid. But I think but a lot of places like GMHC would sometimes use us as the bad cop so they could play the good cop and then go in, and not in a way of to undercut us, but once we started protesting being the bad cop on certain issues, they could go in as the good cop and get a meaning that they could not have gotten before, and then get what they wanted.
Negotiate. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Do you have more questions for me, or are we through them?
Well, I think some of them you covered. Like, what do you remember about first meeting me? What impact did I have on your life?
Yeah.
And why is it so... and I think we answered these already. Why is it so important to remember the past? We talked about that. And did you ever return to being Santa again? And you did.
I did, but after about 3 years, I stopped because it was depressing every year. It brought up all the issues. So for the last 2 years or so of the lawsuit, I just bypassed it.
Yeah.
Good. Well, John, do you want to make a time maybe to talk other than this, to catch up a little more?
I would really love that. And
let's talk about that just before we end, and we can make arrangements, or I can send you a message on Facebook.
Oh, we have email
we can
now.
We can figure out how to do it.
And when traveling gets back to normal, I would like to visit.
We'll talk about that.
But see you. Yeah.
Let's go ahead.
I really love you, Mark. I just want to say that.
I do. I feel the same way.
And it's such a weird relationship. But yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but it's and I didn't want to talk to you before today, but I'm dying to ask you things about your life.
Me too.
I'm going to go home and go through your Facebook page.
Okay.
But let's finish up the questions so that people can go home. It's late in the day here in Amsterdam.
Yes.
And they're paying for studio time.
Yes. Designing Women was a TV show in the 80s, produced by Linda Bloodworth Thompson, about these three strong Southern women who had a interior design firm. And Linda Bloodworth Thompson's mother contracted AIDS through a blood transfusion. And she overheard somebody say, well, AIDS is killing all the right people. And it so angered her to hear someone say that about after her mother died. And she wrote an episode called Killing All the Right People, which was the first TV show to directly deal with AIDS. And the premise behind the episode was Tony Goldwyn, in one of his first TV roles, plays another designer that they knew. And he hires the Sugar Baker women to design his funeral because he's dying of AIDS. And one of Julia's old friends, who was like a frenemy and whatever, she just says, like, how can you do that for one of those people? Oh, AIDS is killing all the right people. And then Dixie Carter, who plays this woman, just goes into this tirade that you can see on YouTube, which is worth Googling. It's phenomenal, where she's just, I know your history, I know my history. If AIDS was God's judgment against people who are sexually promiscuous, both of us would have it. And it just tore into this woman. And it was just such a moving episode. And it was the first time not only to talk about AIDS, but to really show, gay men, and that we're not, there's no such thing as that we're all innocent victims. And it was just such a huge, huge thing. Wow. I still get emotional watching that clip of Julia of watching that episode on streaming.
I'm going to watch that. I've watched a few of them on YouTube recently, just in the last couple of months. I'll see if this one's on.
It is.
I haven't seen it.
Mm-hmm. So KS is Kaposi sarcoma, where HIV doesn't directly cause death. It causes the immune system to go into hyperdrive, and then the immune system burns out, and so you don't have an immune system. So people with AIDS end up getting sick with all these diseases that healthy people don't get sick from. So in the early years of HIV, the two most common opportunistic infections were pneumocystis pneumonia, which normally doesn't kill people but was horrific if you didn't have an immune system. And then there was an obscure skin cancer that affected mostly Mediterranean men and older Jewish men called carpysarcoma, which would cause these purple splotches. And it would usually be non-fatal. But if you had AIDS, these splotches would go all over your body. Your legs would swell up so you could hardly walk. And it would also be inside your internal organs, and it was very fatal.
Yes.
And friends of mine who had it, it was not only physically disfiguring to have all these purple splotches and lesions all over your face and body, but it was a very painful disease to die from. And, again, when I had that splotch on my abdomen, I was convinced it was KS. And honestly, at that point, I didn't want to know because there was nothing I could do. And it's like, I don't want to deal with it, because at that point, we didn't really have an AIDS test yet, or it wasn't available. So the perception was that people died within a year of becoming infected. And it was only after we started testing that we realized that there was a incubation period of anywhere from 2 to 10 years before people would start getting opportunistic infections. So when I had that splot, I just didn't want to know what it was. And then I had to see the doctor about something else. I just casually said, what's this? And he's like, oh, it's a fungal infection. And instead of being relieved, I was just angry. I was really angry because it's like every other teenager I'm in high school with feels like they're immortal. And that's been taken away from me, and I know I'm never going to get it back. And, and I was just so angry that as a teenager, I just was no longer going to feel immortal. And, that death was always going to be there, like right in front of me.
Oh, my lawyer, Margaret Winter, I was with her at her mother's house outside of D.C. And so when we heard there'd been a protest, her partner called and basically said there was this protest at Macy's. And so we went out and got all the New York papers to read about it. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was different. It was, I mean, talking about the kids at like Downstate Hospital, that was very joyful. I mean, it in that the scene had none of what you would think would be going on with a group of kids who were probably going to die. It was the same as any other group of kids. And I went home thinking, okay, if they can do this, I can live in the present the way that they do. I'll try to do that. I mean, I can't remember a lot of places, but I went to this place in Harlem called the Upper Room AIDS Ministry. It changed its name later in the years. And it was dealing with a lot of people who... a good proportion of them were homeless who were dealing with AIDS, and a lot of them had gotten it through drug use. So it was a different population. And I remember one year, and Douglas Martin, in the second article that he wrote about me, went with me on that day. And there was a couple who were both infected, and I don't know if they had AIDS diagnoses, but they had met and they were going to get married. And so in the midst of this uncertainty in their lives, they were in love and they were going to take the step of getting married. And that's such an optimistic thing. I mean, there were all sorts of things like that. I got to go to Hale House. I wasn't Santa there, because they wanted an African-American Santa, which makes sense. But I got to go for their Christmas party and see all the little kids and meet Mother Clara Hale. And that somehow was a big deal to me because of the work that she'd done. I can't remember the other specifics, but there were, I went to other parties, and then there was a daycare center in Greenwich Village that was just a regular daycare center. There weren't kids with HIV. They had me come and be their Santa. I haven't thought about it in years. I never think about this anymore.
But what can I add one thing that really has impacted me is looking at Macy's through the years since then, where, like now at Gay Pride in New York, Macy's has a contingent with their out gay employees. And that's sponsored by the company. And they don't have any of the big balloons from the Thanksgiving parade, but they have the smaller star balloons that one person can carry that are there. And going to the Macy's store locally in the past 2 years, during Gay Pride Month, they have all these, Gay Pride T-shirts and Gay Pride, all these like things. And they're corporate, they're commercializing it. But, it makes me feel happy to see that they have grown and that Macy's is not the enemy anymore. The way they were.
Never were.
But it makes me happy that in our own way, we may have contributed a little bit in them becoming, so proactively pro-LGBT. And I really,
possibly.
And it makes me feel good now seeing them doing what they're doing, which I realize, they're making money off of it, but it's good to
That
see that they're
doesn't
embracing
matter.
us. They're not Chick-fil-A.
Yes, exactly. There was nothing mendacious about Macy's behavior. It was a clumsy mistake.
Yes.
And as you said earlier, they treated their gay and lesbian employees pretty well.
They're year-round employees well.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me just say one more thing. I went online last night to see what they're doing with Santa, and you can go to Santa this year if you make a reservation, and they have a Zoom Santa also.
Wow.
And it's like, if I were in New York, I would go see Santa this year. I mean,
I
if
would go
there's
with
ever
you
a year, if there's ever a year when you need that kind of fantasy and make believe, I think this is it. It's
If you
anyway.
ever do that, call me, because I would travel down just so we could get our pictures taken together with Macy's
With
Santa.
Santa. Oh, that would be so wonderful. Because it really is the best thing to do at Christmas. Even if you aren't Christian, if you don't believe in Santa. I mean, it's not about
Jewish
religion.
here.
It's about fantasy. Well, I had a little girl who mentioned that, but go ahead. You had some more questions, Ellen. Yeah. It's important to remember your history, and this was a pivotal thing in the history of our community. And the other thing that, I mean, there's so much that hasn't been written. I don't know that if anyone's talked about the role that lesbians played in taking care of us during this. I mean, there's just so much that rolls over. It's the same as remembering the people in the 40s and 50s, like the Mattachine Society in Los Angeles and Harry Hay in Los Angeles, and all the people who started meeting and started political movements to make us viable people. We were supposed to live in the shadows.
Everything about that, but also when you don't know your history, you repeat it. And I look at COVID, which also Fauci, big figure during the HIV plague years, big figure doing this. And also the same people and the same political groups that were politicizing a pandemic and a health issue back in the 80s or 90s are the people who are anti-prevention and politicizing a health crisis now. And, that hasn't changed. And you need to, and I know that in terms of me personally navigating this past year of COVID, my experience in ACT UP and with AIDS really helped me develop my own tools to navigate it. And, everything we learned back then is so relevant now. And, and it's been painful this past year seeing our country repeat all these bad lessons we didn't learn from the AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
So you do need to learn your history, both to honor the past, but also so you don't repeat it.
I don't remember. I went to the meeting to to thank the group for what they had done, and I spoke just a couple of minutes. I was very uncomfortable being in the meeting, just because it was a large crowd. I don't know if I met John then. My first memory of John is at that party. Oh, yeah. The first time I met you that I remember was at that party. I don't remember. I had totally forgotten about going to that meeting and thanking people for the action. It it had just slipped my mind. And I remember standing in the room being uncomfortable and speaking a little bit. But I had met Elizabeth by then. But I first remember you from that party. And
Yeah,
you
I
were just a
remember.
live wire.
I didn't know you were going to be at that meeting, and I was surprised. I was sitting at the opposite end of the room, and this was in James Wagner's apartment in Chelsea on 23rd Street. And I don't remember you coming up and talking to me individually. But also, again, this action wasn't me. Again, there was more than 30 people involved in it, and we all contribute. So regardless of who even proposes an action, these were all collective efforts, and it was all of us who pulled it off. So it wasn't just me. But yeah, I didn't really talk to you one-on-one until that party.
No,
Everything.
not now.
Everything. I mean, it's like, which we'll
Yes.
continue later, but I
Yes.
really have more things than I could possibly fit into a full day of conversation with Mark. You know?
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.